Nicholas. Okay.
Okay.
Alice, do you have to register to get on Zoom, or could I tell my family right now to do it, or do you have to have done it in advance?
The only way to get the link, okay, do you want, how do I get the link? Why don't I post, let me take 2 minutes and put it right on the front of the website.
Okay, perfect.
Facebook, are they on Facebook?
Probably.
Can be.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, everyone did so.
They have such plexiglass. It is a plexiglass. It is nice. Or silver lines, yeah. And that was great.
It's very close. I think those men.
Different combos there on its own.
And the shoulder to shoulder.
I know.
It's really risky.
Brother's taking his work to do this for Reno for Christmas. The typical ways you take all his kids are like either in college or just working. They all have off. So not often, but maybe every other year. And I was really say worried about that year.
Which one is it? We were saying. I sent the calendar away.
What are the numbers like?
Work any longer than he had to. I was like, oh man, he's at the table forever. I said, but they just go and bring our books by and say, just, I haven't dropped them back in the mailbox because she said that. Thanks. Thanks. No, I don't want to make it worse. Yeah. Perfect.
We lost our cats. We got full-time job.
No, yeah. So we're just saying, you were so happy about that.
Well, it was that. I'm okay with that. But, I don't know if you know Susan. Where I live. Anyway, she has a cat service.
Hi, I'm Alice Hutchinson. I own Bird's Books directly across the street. We are very small independent bookstores, and just to dispel the myth that little independent bookstores are going out of business, do not tell anyone, but we're up over 20% this year. I just told everyone, of course. The reason that happened is because of community. During the pandemic, when we all got the signal to shut down and kind of go away, we shut down our store and became a curbside pickup. We brought it to your car. We didn't know whether touch was a thing, so we took our front counter and U-shaped it against the door, and you came in and stood there. I'm going to date myself, and it was like service merchandise. Can I see that book? And I would bring it up, and I would show it to you, and you would then take it in a bag, stick it in your trunk, and let it air out. I mean, it was 12 to 15 hours a day of dealing with pandemic. What saved me were two things. One, the New England Independent Booksellers Association that I belong to had an every Wednesday lunchtime Zoom where all of us got together and said, what are you doing? How are you dealing with this? Well, Do you let the UPS man in? I mean, all of those questions that we didn't even know what to do. We didn't know whether touch was going to cause a problem. I mean, just all of it. So we'd fill orders and tell people to pick them up the next day so that they could age in the bag. I mean, that kind of thing. So once we kind of got through that, what started to happen as we opened up the store very gradually is that people came in and said, I don't want to give my money to Amazon anymore. Because it really became a national ethic to keep a downtown healthy. No matter where you live, keep your downtown healthy. And so I would go to Staples purposefully to get office supplies, even though I could order them off at the dreaded A like everybody else. But we don't go to Amazon. We just don't think Jeff needs the money. But downtowns need to be vital. So wherever you live, go to your downtown if you can. I mean, it just kept us alive. Now, we paid the price with 15 to 20-hour days, but we applied for the PPP loans and the EIDL loans and all of those things. And because we're so little and we weren't really asking for a lot, we got them and it kept us going. But the town coming in, and people still to this day walk in and say, we want to give our money to you instead of Amazon, means something. And it's become, as jaded as all of us can get about this, that's still meaningful every single day. So I just kind of wanted to let you know that that's still happening out there. People are still going into little bakeries. They're not buying everything at Costco. They're going into little places and saying, I really want to keep those little places alive. So there's hope. The reason that we're 20% up is really because when the school decides to have one book for a summer reading book, they send everybody to us. So they made that decision too. And so there are things that really make it work, but all of us have had to be creative. I don't know whether it's going away. We still require masks in the store. And as I said to somebody earlier, we have several of our patients who are quite ill. I want to be able to have some place where they can go. I would do that just for them. It's just, they have cancer and they're on chemo and they want to come in. That's fine. We'll all wear a mask and we'll make it a safe place. And I just don't want to kind of be the mask police. I'm a bookstore. So we're tiny. We sell lots of books. And the town seems to like us this size. We've been larger. Now we're smaller. So that's kind of where it is. But I wanted to give you the good news that there are places that are making it today. Whether that lasts or not, you never know. Before I forget, I sincerely want to thank Amy Davenport for making this happen. Because it's just, the partnership that we have with the Bethel Library is impactful for me. Our little store can really comfortably now hold about 15 to 20 people, but this time of year, because the tables are so full of books, we can't move the furniture because normally it's on wheels and we slide it into the toy store and make space. Well, not right now. So thank you, Amy, for making this available to us. It's lovely to have this relationship. I really appreciate it. For those of you on Zoom, please ask questions in the chat and I will make sure that they are asked in the evening. I know that independent bookstores drive titles that aren't Anthony Doerr and Clive Cussler and some of the big, Ivanovich and the big titles. We are the ones that are focused on a layer of books like this, where although the big stores will know about this book, the little stores zero in. The independent bookstore is where this happens, where the intimacy of an author event and the connectedness between an author and a bookstore really happens. So I know that you've been going all over the country and that kind of thing happens in independent bookstores. And I really just want to say that it makes a big, big difference to an author to have that relationship. I'm going to introduce Ivan. I'm sure most people here already know him, but for those of you who don't, Ivan Maisel is Vice President, Editorial Senior Writer at on3.com. He has covered college football for nearly 4 decades, from 2002 to 2021 as a senior writer for ESPN, where he wrote for ESPN.com, appeared on television, ESPN radio, and on podcasts. He also served as editor at large for ESPN College Football 150. Prior to joining ESPN.com, Maisel covered college football for Sports Illustrated, Newsday, the Dallas Morning News. He has been honored 8 times for Best Story by the Football Writers Association of America and twice by the Associated Press Sports Editors, which in 2019 named him one of the best 10 sports columnists. Maisel earned a bachelor's degree in American Studies from Stanford University. Thank you, Ivan. And you don't have to wear your mask to speak. I just keep it on.
Okay.
I forgot to take it off.
Thank you, Amy, for hosting. Just want you to know I do not have a nervous tick, but I am going to look at the camera over here occasionally. So if you see me do this, I'm trying to be welcoming to those people as well. A year ago, I walked into Bird's Books. It was about this time last year. And I walked over to Alice and threw my mask, said, "I live in Fairfield and I wrote a book." And her eyes sort of glazed over. I could see the sort of defensive crowd she was getting at. And I said, "Actually, Hachette it's publishing it." And then she relaxed a little bit, and we talked, and Alice has been invaluable to me in a lot of ways, both as a source of information about how to sell books, and as a cheerleader, and she's been a great source for me, and I know our friendship will last long after this. So I'm going to start. The premise of the book is really our son Max ended his life in February of 2015. And the book is about Max, but it's also about grief. And it's about how I learned to carry the grief and continue on with my life. And it is my story. My wife is sitting in the back. It is not her story or our daughter's story. And grief, one thing I learned, and I learned a lot, is that everything about grief is individual. Each person grieves differently. This is my story, and I wrote it really because I was terrible at grief. I was scared of it. I was scared, I was petrified of it. I didn't handle it well when my father died in 2007. I didn't handle it well when my friends needed comforting. If I said anything, if I could gin up the nerve to say anything, I said it once and I considered that box checked, which is just so wrong on so many levels. But I was scared. And then I didn't have a choice. So I learned a lot about grief. And I wrote the book both because I didn't want Max to be defined by how he died. I wanted to tell people who he was, but that to me was not enough of a reason to write a book. He was a great kid, but who's going to read a book? I had trouble convincing myself that anybody really would care about reading a book just about my son. So, but it occurred to me that we're all so bad at grief, so many of us, that if I could be, the best term I could come up with was if I could be a docent through my grief, and how I learned to carry it, and how I learned to what worked to comfort me and what didn't work, that maybe it would help somebody, and maybe other people wouldn't have to would handle it as poorly as I did. So that's the premise, and I'm going to start by reading just how I came to my understanding of grief. On a very cold night of a very cold winter, our 21-year-old son Max walked off an ice-slicked pier onto the surface of Lake Ontario. We, my wife Meg, his sisters Sarah and Elizabeth, and I, presume that he walked until the ice gave way beneath him. We don't know. We will never know. An eyewitness saw him get out of his car, an 11-year-old SUV that once had belonged to his beloved grandfather, and walk onto the pier. Law enforcement eventually spotted some of Max's belongings near the end of the pier on the solid surface of the lake. And 8 weeks later, the 4th week of spring, according to the calendar, Lake Ontario surrendered his body. It would not be much of a whodunit. Those are the facts that we know. He left no note. Max wasn't much on communicating. I keep trying to catch his eyes about the death of my son Max, the grief that engulfed our family, and how I learned to coexist with that grief. I will not be so presumptuous as to include here how my wife and our 2 daughters have dealt with their grief. That consideration is pretty rich, given that what I do for a living as a journalist is become presumptuous enough to write a story and explain someone I hardly know. But, and this will not be the first time you read this in these pages, little is more personal than grief. All grief is personal, and all grief is as individual as the person doing the grieving. Love is personal too, and there's certainly no shortage of writing about love. As I wrote, I began to understand that grief, if you get past the awkward social construct that American culture has with death, is the purest expression of love for someone who is no longer here to express it back. We mourn the deepest for those whom we love the most. We view grief warily as an alien force that invades us when we are at our most vulnerable. I'm not going to pretend that I didn't suffer greatly when Max died. I'm not going to tell you that I didn't ache or that I no longer feel a void. But as I learned how to go on with my life, as I wrestled with and tried to make sense of my pain, I began to see the direct correlation between the love I had for the son I lost and the depth of my pain, my grief. Grief is love. So that, as I've said, that grief is love is what made sense to me. And a lot had to happen for me to figure that out. The first thing was realizing that it wasn't going to go away, that it wasn't something that I could step around or that I could just stiff arm. You know, all I learned about trying to stiff arm it is that your arm gets really tired after a while. And there was a couple of moments where I realized the permanence of it. One was I read, there was a poet named Edward Hirsch who wrote a book-length poem that was really an ode to his son who had died. And the name of the book is Gabriel. And in that book, Hirsch describes grief as a bag of cement that you carry up a hill that never ends. And that hardly, as I say that, it doesn't really sound comforting, does it? But I found great solace in that, and that it made me understand the permanence of what I was dealing with. And that my job was to get used to the weight and to learn how to, that it was always going to be right here, and just that I had to learn to go on while it was right here. And once I did that, you know, then I just started thinking, well, why am I in so much pain? And you learn as time goes on, that, you know, you catch yourself having a good few minutes, and then you catch yourself having a good hour, and then maybe eventually even have a good day. We have a neighbor in Fairfield whose husband died suddenly. And she said to me, and it sounds a little hallmarky, but it really resonated with me, that she had been told grief is like standing at the shore. And that sometimes, you know, the water washes over your ankles, and sometimes it washes over your head. But in both cases, it goes back out. And that really helped me, just that there was a temporal nature to the pain, that it would ebb and flow. And I learned that when it really flowed, that it would stop, you know, and I just had to sort of relax and let it happen. I couldn't fight. So as I began to think more about just why I was in so much pain, you know, I began to think, well, it's because I love him so much. And I'm a journalist, and what we do is try to say something meaningful in as few words as possible. You know, if you go back, if you read Strunk and White enough, I don't know how many y'all ever use Strunk and White, but, you know, he tells you not to use adjectives, you know, and I'm old fashioned enough that I try not to. And so I eventually just sort of kept thinking about it, and, you know, and there is a saying that grief is the price we pay for love. But even to me, that's too much. You know, I think it's more basic than that. I think grief is love. You know, that's and that idea really sort of sustained me in learning why I was in so much pain, and helped me carry it and help me deal with it. So that was a great help. And there were other, you know, I had other things that had other tricks I used, for lack of a better word, or just advice I got, wisdom that was given me. As I said, when I read that we didn't recover Max's body for 8 weeks, but the very first week after we came back from Rochester, I got a phone call from a woman I grew up with, who is now on the faculty at the Duke University School of Medicine. And we had not spoken in 30 years, but our mothers were best friends, so we always kept up with one another. And Robin called me, and she is a psychologist. She was working at Oklahoma State University when the Murrah building was bombed, and she has, by dint of her experience, become the national expert on dealing with children who have suffered terroristic trauma. You know, when the Marathon bombing happened, they dispatched her to Boston. I mean, she goes all over the country. So Robin called me that first week. We hadn't spoken since high school, I'm reasonably certain, maybe in college. And she talked to me for 90 minutes. And she said a couple of things that really carried me. And one was, you will never understand why he did what he did, and you are not built to understand it because you think rationally. And this was an irrational act done by someone who's not thinking the way we think. And that may have been a get out of jail free card for guilt, but I carried it in my pocket, you know, and it still sustains me. You know, I just, you know, I believe it makes sense to me, and it helped me greatly. I feel like I saved a lot of steps by understanding that. And the other thing that helped me greatly was the decision that Meg and I made to not hide it, to be public about what happened to Max. Now we had to decide really fast, because if you work for ESPN and you're a front-facing employee of ESPN and your son goes missing, that's what the headline says. son of ESPN writer goes missing. You know, I remember that headline. You know, Max, I will tell you a little bit about Max soon, but I'll start off by saying Max did not like attention. And that was one of the few laughs we got that first week, because People magazine did a story, you know, and he was on television, and our Fairfield, you know, people in our neighborhood tied ribbons around trees, and there were pictures of him in stores in our neighborhood. And he would have been mortified, I think. But we had to decide right away, you know, how are we going to handle this? And as a journalist, the last thing I wanted to do to anybody was say no comment. But also, the noble side of me says that mental illness needs sunlight. That, you know, we can't hide it, and I didn't want our silence to be interpreted as shame. You know, we aren't ashamed of Max. He was sick, and mental illness is clearly, it can be as deadly as cancer. In my parents' generation, nobody talked about cancer, and if they did, it was sort of sotto voce. You know, you sometimes didn't even tell the patient that they had cancer. Once we brought cancer out into the open, just over the course of my lifetime, we've made incredible strides, you know, around the world. And we're beginning to do that with mental illness. We're certainly not there yet, but we're beginning to do it. I feel like, you know, the problems that have been created by mental illness, it's almost like global warming are coming at us faster than what we're doing. But we're cognizant of it as a society, and we're a lot better off than we used to be. We just need to do more. So that's the noble side of me. The practical side of me was those first few days, you know, it was all we could do to put one foot in front of the other. You know, I wasn't eating. I didn't eat that first week. You know, I couldn't complete a sentence. And the last thing I wanted to have to decide was who knew what, you know, who got to know what, you know, because then all of a sudden you're giving out clearance like you're the CIA. You know, oh, you're a second cousin. Let's see, what are we telling you? You know, I just didn't want to do that. And it just put everything out there, and it saved us a lot of wear and tear. And in the end, and I think I said this to Meg, what difference does it make? You know, what people know or don't know. You know, either way, he's not here, and that's the main thing. So I'm really glad that we did what we did and that we went public. And I think the fact that we did, the way it was received when we did go public was so gratifying, really, that people understood that it was important that we do this, that it propelled me in a way to at least begin to consider the notion that maybe someday I would write the book. That took 5 years to come to that conclusion, which was really more of me needing perspective to be able to tell the story in a way that it needed to be told. And just to get my feet under me again, and, you know, and get my life going again. I didn't do it for therapeutic reasons. I didn't do it for cathartic reasons. I think I had already done all that before I was able to write it. And I didn't like the idea of writing a book cathartically, which to me is, you know, you pay me $28 and then I dump all my problems in your lap. You know, thank you. You know, and I didn't, that transaction didn't really, you know, I didn't like that. So once I decided to write, it really was, you know, I wrote it, the pandemic helped, you know, I wasn't in college football for a long time last year. And so I had plenty of time. And it was, I say I didn't write it just to tell people who Max was, but that was part of it. And Max, as I said, was our middle child and was painfully shy and withdrawn. And that was really a defense mechanism. When Max was about 18 months old, he could walk up to you and recite a Dr. Seuss book, which we thought was precocious at least and genius at most, in the way that young parents do. And one of our neighbors is a child psychologist and said to us, no, that could be something you need looked at. And it turns out he was somewhere unspecified on the spectrum, which was the only diagnosis we ever got over the course of his entire life. And we got it over and over and over again. It was not, he did not have autism. He did not have Asperger's or whatever we call Asperger's now. He just was somewhere on the spectrum. How did that manifest itself? He had trouble with social cues. He had trouble interacting with his peers. And he put up a wall really out of self-preservation, out of self-protection, probably a better way to put it. And so he came across as shy and withdrawn. He was, I think the phrase he used, comically tall. He was 6'5", and almost weighed 140 pounds. If you gave him, some barbells and put him in heavy boots. So he was very tall, very thin. Now behind that wall that he put up, he was really a sweet, big doughy lump of sweetness, and cared deeply about people, and was really funny. Had a delightfully dry sense of humor, which I had groomed in him chiefly because he had absolutely no interest in sports, which for my son to have absolutely no interest in sports, I just decided was proof God had a sense of humor. I didn't, I just naively assumed that because, he was my son, he would do what I did, which was, learn to read on the sports pages and learn division by doing earned run averages. And, that was, and he couldn't have cared less about any of it. So what I did was I got him into comedy very early, Looney Tunes and Marx Brothers. And from that, he developed a love of movies and a love of wordplay and a love of Broadway. We try to take the kids to a show every year, at least one. And as most teenage boys of his generation did, he was very much into video games, very much into anime. And that's where he developed his friends, where mostly his friends were people he played with online. He had very few friends growing up. Everybody was nice to him as far as we know, and liked him, but he kept his distance, and he was not a kid that was going to go out and do stuff with other kids. So along about high school, he developed a love of photography. And which was odd because he didn't like to have his picture taken, which was certainly part of his personality. And he didn't like to take pictures of people. He liked to take landscapes. He liked to take architecture. Just something would hit his eye, and he'd take. We have some of his photographs hanging in our house now. He went to RIT in part. I don't know if he went there for his photography curriculum or he just fell into it when he was there. He loved, he enjoyed the photography classes. He fretted terribly about whether he was going to succeed, to the point that a couple of professors really sort of kept an eye on him to make sure he was okay. And he had talent, they told us as much. photo on the cover is a self-portrait. Max had an assignment for a class to take a photo for the flap, an author photo for the flap of a book of his photography. Now that's an author photo for a book flap. That's what Max turned in, and that was Max. He didn't want to have his picture taken. That is Lake Ontario in front of him. My brother-in-law has a house on Lake Ontario, and it's a mile west of the pier that Max walked down. So he knew the area and was very comfortable in the area. This is what he turned in, and I kind of feel like A, it's cool because now he's a published photographer, and B, I feel like we completed the assignment because he is on a book jacket. The title of the book, the wallpaper on my phone is a picture of our 3 children at our oldest college graduation. And the 2 girls are looking right at the camera, big grins on their faces. Max is doing this. And about 3 years ago, I was just sitting at my desk one day and I'm looking at my phone and I'm like, Max, look at me, look at me. And I keep trying to catch his eye. And I wrote an essay about that, then published it on Medium. And again, the reception of the essay sort of made me think, okay, maybe you need to write something longer at some point. So that's a good place to stop. I think that, take questions. You want me to take questions here or from you? Or?
I don't see any coming up from the Zoom meeting, but I do have a question. You mentioned that it took you 5 years to decide to write the book, but how long did it take you to actually write it?
Well,
homework on it, it's okay.
Yes, I want to be accurate. I think my process was pretty much like Hemingway and Faulkner and Fitzgerald. At the end of every day, I would check word count and see whether I had gotten up to what the contract said. And I think that's what all the great ones did. I think I started writing. Here's what happened. Meg and I were in Chicago. It's now almost, I guess it was almost 2 years ago. And we had lunch with a college friend of mine. And she is a big booster of mine. We worked together on the school paper. And at lunch, she almost came over to the top of the table at me. When are you going to write about Max? And I had kind of been thinking, I'm going to do this. But she sort of put a boot in my rear. And I wrote a proposal in May, April or May, and sent it off. And my agent called me back and she said, after a couple of weeks, she said, I've read this. This is beautifully written. She said, but you wrote it like you're writing about somebody else, which for 40 years is what I've done. And I've studiously and assiduously kept myself out of what I write. But that's how I was trained. She said, this book needs to be about you and Max. And I was like, oh. Okay. And
Great.
Yeah. And it was a 15,000 word proposal that I rewrote in a weekend. It was like standing here and looking at the room, and then all of a sudden standing over here and going, oh, okay, I get that. And once I did that, I had to turn it in December 1st, and I was finished about mid-November. And again, didn't have a lot to do at work last year. It was a godsend. The funniest thing that happened I'm a journalist, and you hit your deadline when you're supposed to hit your deadline because you don't have a choice if you want to get a paycheck. And I didn't send it to him, to the editor, on November 15th. It was due on December 1st. So at noon on December 1st, I hit send. And an hour later, I get an email back from him that says, "Oh my God, you made the deadline." And I was like, yeah. He said, "Nobody does that. This is a book publisher." So I felt good about that. But, and they were really not, editing was easy. They were good.
Did you read other books on grief in this process at all?
Maybe one, maybe two.
Some people find comfort in a book and other people don't.
Meg read a lot of books on grief.
Listen to David Kessler.
I listened to an interview with David Kessler, who is the national expert on grief, and that was very helpful. That was helpful in writing, but in terms of comfort and solace, I found that a lot of books were written more for the author, if that makes sense, especially in writing about whoever was the deceased was. You need to know who this person is, and I respect that. But that's not really something I wanted to read. It wasn't going to help me process. I needed to know about how to deal with my grief, and everybody's different. But there were a couple that there's a guy named Bill Hancock, who I know through work. He runs the college football playoff, and his son, his adult son, died in a private plane crash 20 years ago. And he wrote a book about his son and about his death, and that was called "Riding with the Blue Moth." And it was about his cross-country bike ride after his son died. It was really that was his vehicle to talk about Will and what had happened. And I know Bill, so I could relate to it, so that was helpful. But by and large, no, I mean, there weren't a lot. Anyone here? Okay. Well, thank you.
How did your daughters handle it?
How did our daughters handle it? Differently. They handled it differently. We have, and I'm glad you asked that question, because our oldest is very, very high emotional IQ. Was living in San Francisco. She was 8 months out of college when Max died. And she took the red eye to Rochester. We had driven up, and we picked her up, that morning. We were about 10 steps into the Rochester airport, and Sarah says to us, "I've been reading, and half the parents who lose a child get divorced. Are y'all getting divorced?" "Hi, honey." I said, no, let's do one disaster at a time, okay? And but it's a fascinating, and this is where David Kessler really helped me, because he talked about this, and what he said was, it's not the death of the child that causes parents to split. It's the fact that they judge each other's grief. Why aren't you crying? Why are you crying? Why don't you go to the cemetery every day? Why will you not come to the suicide survivor group with me? Whatever it is. Meg and I have had nearly a 40-year relationship now, where we've been very accommodating of one another, which is pretty much how we started out, because I'm Jewish and from Mobile, Alabama, and she's Catholic from Syracuse, New York. So we had a lot of accommodating to do to figure out how we were going to make a life together. And when this happened, we've always just kind of let each other be we are, and we grieved very differently, and as did the girls. Sarah went, our oldest, the emotionally astute one, went straight to a grief counselor, and she went a year and a half. Elizabeth, our youngest, was a senior in high school when Max died, and she's a very private person anyway. And then went off to college, and she had to decide, am I going to tell people what happened or not? And how am I going to deal with it? And it was very easy as a freshman going to a new life to try not to deal with it. And all we kept saying to them was, look, you don't care what you do, but you need to do something. Because if you don't control how this comes out of you, it will control how it comes out of you. And when it decides to come out, that may not be convenient for the rest of your life. And, Elizabeth has come a long way, and they both have. We all have. But and they were all three of them were very emotionally generous to give me the room to write a book, because it is an enormous eyeball on their lives as well.
What's been the experience of the book tour? I mean, it's got to be different in every place that you talk about this book. What's it been like?
It's been interesting, and I've been probably done this 15 to 20 times. From where I grew up in Alabama, as far west as Denver, and Nashville, and Dallas, and Atlanta. I was in Atlanta last week. What's been interesting, and this is more about me than about the reception, is as I have continued to tell the story, I've kind of learned more things about this whole process. And one is the idea of accommodation I just told you. I mean, that's just sort of something I've kind of realized, and people, my readership has come out in some places, which is nice. The people who have read me for years, and we have lived all over the country. So I've gone back to where we, lived, and people have come out and know us. And the word of mouth of the book has been powerful. And I think what's interesting is my understanding of this whole process, especially the more I go out, is that once they established October 26th as publication date, I just assumed that was the arrival of all good things. And what I have learned is that was the starting line. And that, it's just, and learning to talk about it. It's been it hasn't been tough to talk about. And again, I think that goes back to the decision to be public from the get-go. The whole notion, people have said to me for years, but I've heard it a lot in the last months, you're so courageous to do this. But, no. Courage implies that you have a choice not to do it. And I guess I had a choice whether to write the book or not, but we didn't have a choice of whether we were going to deal with this or not. We had to deal with it. And, part of the reason to write the book was just to explain to people, no, this has been our life, and this is what this is like.
Is it difficult to go back to Rochester?
It is for me. I think and
Because you mentioned earlier you have family there.
we do have family there, and we still go every summer. We try to go every summer. COVID's had something to do with that. But when we go there, we're very, we don't usually leave my brother-in-law's house except to walk down to the pier, because there's a great frozen custard stand right there, which was Max's home away from home when we were up there. And it's just very, that part of Rochester is very comfortable. I remember the first family reunion, which we have every summer up there, that we went that summer of 2015. There was traffic the way I usually go to the house, and I swung around over near our RIT to go that way up to the house. And that was hard, just because, not that we spent a lot of time in RIT, but just because we just brought up a lot of things. And I'm okay going up there. It's not like it's not like I can't, but it's an emotionally fraught visit most of the time.
Do you think that the book tour has helped you, or is it just?
Yeah.
How do you feel about it?
I do think it's helped more just because talking about it, I've kind of, as I said, I've kind of learned things about as I've sort of tried to piece together how I do these talks, because I don't do them the same every time. I know the points I want to make, and I just sort of go from one to another, but as I talk about them, I sort of develop other ideas.
Anybody have any other questions?
Do you think, you mentioned shining a light, right? So do you think that light is getting brighter? And as a journalist, is the conversation, I feel like Naomi Osaka, we've had a lot of talk, and I think COVID has something to do with it too. Is that light shining brighter every day, that we're kind of, Alice talked about community at the start, right? We're all responsible for each other to a certain extent. And I'm wondering if just in your experience with professional sports and college sports, if it's been a dialogue that's been increasing.
Well, it's funny, Siobhan, that you say that. I mean, and you could, it's not just Naomi Osaka, Simone Biles,
Yep.
Kevin Love,
Yep.
Calvin Ridley,
Yep.
the Atlanta Falcons. I was talking to a guy, a former head football coach at a couple of schools who works for Fox, and I was talking to him today. And we were talking about the book, and he said when he got, and this was not 10 years ago, but when he took a big job in the Pac-12, but he was amazed / appalled at the number of issues he had to deal with, anxiety and mental health within his locker room, and that they were so poorly equipped to deal with it. There has been a groundswell of reaction in colleges, and that's the side of the street I work. The University of Nebraska, for instance, now has 5 psychologists in the athletic department.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's just Nebraska. And he was saying that his school, it was Chris Peterson, who's a guy who used to be at the University of Washington, and he said Washington has hired psychologists, and they're all aware of it, and they're all trying to do their best. And a lot of what kickstarted it, or at least that it sort of burst into the open, was the death of Tyler Golinski, who I write about in the book. He was a quarterback at Washington State University who ended his life in January of 2018. And Tyler and his parents are a chapter in this book, because I ended up doing a story about them on ESPN. And Mark and Kim Golinski, after his death, began a foundation that has done tremendous work, and they have raised funds to create programs for athletic departments to better deal with mental health, and to give them strategies and protocols to deal with good mental health among their athletes. So there's a much greater awareness now, but I think the problems are multiplying faster than the awareness. And it's they are trying. 3rd.
On your tour, your response, are you finding more and more, a lot of people like coming out, talking about it more? They've approached you privately and feel better hearing about your book and just like a set off like a chain reaction? Do you feel?
I do feel, somebody will say something at an event, or I will, the response, I'd say almost every day, somebody will tweet at me. I got one from a high school counselor in the state of Washington yesterday, and, thanking me for writing the book. And there is an appreciation of it. And there's a lot out there. And honestly, one thing I noticed almost immediately after Max died was the number of people who said something to me who I knew and had known for years. And they would just very quietly say to me, well, my brother, or my dad, or something. And I would look at them and think, well, I thought they seem to me as if they are normal, but they seem to me like they are, they have adjusted, they're living a well-adjusted life. And they have this in their past. So that's achievable. And I took great solace in the way that, from what they would say to me. And, sadly, a lot of people have had to deal with stuff like this, but we do. And to your point, I heard from, 6, 8, 10 men in and out of either sports or broadcasting. Some of whom I knew a little, some of them I didn't know at all. Friends of friends who would just call me out of the blue and say, hey, I'm 3 years farther down the road than you. This is what has helped me. This is what you need to think about. And so anytime somebody says something to me, I try to listen and respond, because I feel as if I'm paying it forward for what was done for me.
Well, you already have in the case of one of the members of my book group came in, and she was buying a book for some trip or other, because she travels. And I recommended your book, and she bought it, she read it, she came back to me later, and she said, I don't know whether I've shared this with you, but I have the exact same experience.
Wow.
Because we lost our son, and she started in, and it was one of those days where magically it was a bubble with nobody else around.
Yeah.
And those things happen. You think serendipitously, but I don't believe that's true. And she just said, and so she told me the story of her son. And she said, you be sure to tell Ivan that he's right on, that it is exactly how you feel. It is exactly the transformation you go through. It is still something that, of course, I mourn the loss of my son, but each day gets a little better in some forms and not others. But she had a very long dialogue about how much she respected the fact that you wrote the book, but the fact that it really did say what it needed to say to other people, either in grief or needing to learn or wanting to learn about grief, but also about Max.
Yeah. Well,
She
thank
said
you.
she was really very glad to learn about him too.
Well, that's great to hear. Yeah,
It's a beautiful book.
oh, thank you. Kevin.
And one
Yeah.
more thing,
Sure.
my experience, I have a colleague at ESPN that reached out to you, and my cousin, who just unfortunately lost his son in February 19th, called me. And, I obviously knew where I thought my whole life in college football from a separate standpoint, a sports standpoint. And it's pretty amazing because my friend contacted you, and we were allowed him to email you, and within 24 hours, you're on the phone. So, and he, believe me, he called me after that call, tears, that he appreciation. He was beyond overwhelmed that you took the time to talk to him, show the connection. So I appreciate that.
No, sure. Yeah. No.
And unfortunately, he couldn't be here tonight because he fell ill. Bill was actually supposed to be here. So
Yeah.
we'll catch you at the next one. So.
Thank you for telling me. Yeah. No, it's, I wish there were more you could do, you know. But it's do what you can.
Thank you, Evan. I have a friend who lives up in Boston, and I sent him this book. And I just thought he would be interested in the subject matter. And his son is about Max and Day, he's on the spectrum, he has autism. He read the book, he was completely blown away by the book. And when he was talking about the book, he was crying. The reason why he was crying, he thought this book may continue.
Wow.
Not that it's going to interrupt any rational act at any time, but he's really thought that this person see this grown man and breaking down just so read that I recommend to him. So it was really something to see. So
Wow.
it had an effect on him that way. It's probably had an effect on fathers.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you all. Appreciate you being here.
I
Whoever's
thank you
online.
so much for coming. I really